Tonight, the politics of racial privilege. A white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, was let off without charge after shooting an unarmed black teen. 10 days ago, a similar incident for the officer involved in the death of New Yorker Eric Garner. And it's raising questions about the difference between how whites and minorities are treated on both sides of the border.
I did nothing. Sitting here the whole time on our business.
When New York cops surrounded him, Eric Garner seemed agitated, even scared.
Don't touch me. Don't touch me.
And he was right to be.
I can't breathe.
Bystanders watched as he lay on the street for long minutes, dying. For the white cop behind the fatal chokehold, the decision last week was no charges. For many, just the latest proof of racism in the law. And it's shaking cities across the U.S.
If I can't breathe, you can't breathe. I can't breathe.
And Canada isn't immune. Walk down Toronto streets while black, for example, and data shows you're far more likely to be stopped, questioned, and catalogued.
It's wrong. It's illegal. It's immoral. Does it happen? Yeah.
Aboriginal people make up 4% of Canada's population and a quarter of its prison population. Online, the issue is going viral under the hashtag criming while white, which tackles the idea of privilege, as in minorities get profiled while whites get off scot-free.
Arrested for stealing street signs Christmas Eve back in high school, probation waived as it would interfere with drama clubs.
Friend with suspended license gets flat tire and was pulled over in someone else's car. Cop says he will use my license. I was the passenger.
Arrested for driving under the influence. Cop took me to a drive-through ATM so I'd have money to bail myself out.
Joining us now, Tasha Carradine is a columnist with the National Post and iPolitics. Jonathan Kay is the new editor-in-chief of the Walrus magazine. Desmond Cole is a journalist specializing in city politics in Toronto. And Pam Palmater is a Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, and activist. So it's pretty overwhelming to see that video once again of what happened in New York. But I want to talk about those tweets and the thing that sort of exploded out of it this week, which is a new reaction, was this idea of criming while white. I guess, fess up, Tasha. Have you ever gotten away with something you shouldn't have?
Perhaps, but I won't say criming while white so much, perhaps criming while blonde. Traffic violations only, I will confess to playing that sort of card. And I think that, though, when I see these hashtags for much more serious issues, I think it does raise the reality that blacks and whites are treated differently by law enforcement, that they do have different experiences and unfairly different experiences, as this tragedy example of Eric Garner really shows us. John?
46-year-old white man, it's very difficult for me to get the police's attention in any capacity. If they do pay attention to me, it's because I've genuinely done something wrong. I don't just have the advantage of being white, I also have the advantage of being a little bit older. So you also have age privilege going in my favor.
What's your sense watching this, seeing the criming while white hashtag and your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it rings true because I've even been in situations while walking down the street with friends of different races, and I'll be singled out as the black person in the group by the police, and the others won't even be paid any attention. So it does ring true for me, and it's nice to see people acknowledging that their experiences may be different.
White privilege, is it real?
Well, it's definitely real, especially for Indigenous peoples in this country. There is a two-tier justice system, and these stories have been going on for decades and decades about how Indigenous peoples are treated differently. And in terms of white privilege, I myself have been in a vehicle with 6 other Indigenous people, and the one white person doesn't get asked any questions, doesn't get harassed, but the rest of us do. So it's very obvious.
Is this somehow, how does it relate to racism? Is this a form of racism, white privilege?
No, I actually kind of think that racism's like evil cousin, right? Mm-hmm. So white privilege is that ability when you're not the subject of discrimination to not realize that it's going on, to deny that it's going on when people try to bring it to your attention, to kind of be able to be oblivious because it's not your reality. So it's a privilege not to be the subject of racism. That's really what the term is meaning.
I'm not sure if it's not racism, though, but I would take issue with the fact that everyone who might receive it is fully aware. And that's something that I think that the hashtags bring up, that people are assuming that is why they were treated differently, and in many cases this may be the case. I don't think people who are white will specifically use that privilege. I think the issue, though, is that it is racism because it is people treating you differently from others simply because of how you look. So to me, it is actually, it's one and the same, evil cousin or not.
Yeah, it's clearly racism because there's the people who receive it, the privilege itself, and then the people who give it, which are the white people. So it's white society continues to mirror itself and promote its own image in culture, TV, media, and also in terms of the benefits. And so the people giving it are giving it to the people that are most like themselves, and people who are different. The standard is different for Indigenous people, Black people of all types.
John?
The first time I ever thought about white privilege was when probably those words didn't exist, but I remember it was in the 1990s and I was living in Washington, D.C., and I was asking some friends to help me move apartments. And I asked a bunch of guys, and one of them happened to be Black. And he said, you don't really want me to help you move your apartment because what happens is if there's a Black guy with a TV walking down the street, sometimes he'll just get stopped because they assume that he got that TV by stealing it. And it was actually the first time I'd ever thought about that as a white guy, I could walk down the street with a TV and no one will stop me. And I guess that's what white privilege is. It's just the right to do stuff that's perfectly legal and have no one harass you.
Well, that's been some of the reaction to this cramming while white hashtag is like, hey, Black people, we knew this forever, and now that you guys are talking about it, great, welcome to the club. Is it helpful?
I do think it's helpful because one of the ways that we can ultimately address this problem is by people acknowledging that it is a problem, right? So if you have people who are subject to privilege but who don't want to talk about it and who don't want to acknowledge the ways in their experiences might be different.
Is awareness enough, though?
No, absolutely not. It's not enough. It's you know, we can talk about ways in which people can give up their privilege, acknowledge their privilege, but you can't do that until you actually acknowledge that your experience may be different from other people.
Well, I think acknowledging that experience, that the way to bring that home, unfortunately, is if you witness it. I think that's why I was saying sometimes white people may not be aware, because unless you witness it, or unless you have a friend who tells you of an example, you may not be conscious of it. And I think that's where it starts in terms of awareness, but it moves forward then to education and encouraging people to have conversations like this and teaching others, specifically people in positions of authority. I think that's very important because they are the front line. They are people that others in society will look up to in terms of behavior. And if you have police acting as you did in the two cases that you referenced in your introduction, that's where it becomes extremely problematic.
So there was some pushback this week to the cramming while white hashtag saying, okay, now, you know, white people have turned even this story into one about themselves. Do you see this as positive a development or not?
I do see the cramming while white as positive because there's two aspects to this. There's Black and Indigenous people saying, look, we're dying. This is a life and death issue. It's not just about who gets a job and who doesn't. White privilege kills Black and Indigenous people. Cramming while white are people saying, you know what? I see it. I see the difference. And that's half the battle. Because who's going to make the legal and policy changes around this? It's not going to be the disenfranchised or oppressed Black and Indigenous people. It's going to be all the white privileged people that are in government and who are the policymakers.
So how do you, John, how do you fix it? You acknowledge there's a problem. What should be done?
Well, I think on a very basic level, technology is part of the solution. In particular, cameras in police cars. You now have some police forces that they're actually wearing cameras on their uniforms. And in fact, one of the reasons we're talking about this case in New York was that it was on film. The film is very disturbing to watch, and there's some questions about whether we should even be showing it. I actually think it's a good thing that we see it because it's disturbing. And 10 years ago, those videos wouldn't exist. You wouldn't have a chance to see how horrible some of these episodes can be. And you could also put yourselves in the shoes of the onlookers and the police and say, you know, was this a legitimate reaction to what was happening? Because sometimes that's the police narrative. And by the way, often the police are perfectly justified. Sometimes they're accused of brutality, what they do is right. But in this case, you could see that it wasn't justified, and that's because of video. The more video you have, the more accountability you'll have.
At the same time, I mean, cameras are one thing and they're a tool, right? But we have video of watching Eric Garner die, and nothing happened to the person that did it to him. Mm-hmm. So what I think we actually need is accountability. We need to make sure that when somebody does what was done to Eric Garner, or to Mike Brown, or to many other countless young Black men in the United States and here in Canada, that they actually face a punishment. Because it is a privilege not to have to face the consequence of your actions when a kid walking down the street in Toronto is a suspect because of the color of his skin before he's even done anything.
But it doesn't, you're not not going to get that accountability if the people who are on the grand jury don't have the level of knowledge or awareness or education to make that decision. Because in the justice system in the U.S., in any event, it is left to a group of your peers, so to speak, to decide whether the case goes forward. So I think I agree that it is critical that people be brought to account, but to have people be brought to account, you need judges, you need police and justices who have that.
Well, sorry, I'll let Desmond get back in.
Okay.
Well, all I really wanted to say is that, you know, in the United States, when a prosecutor wants an indictment, they get it 99.99999% of the time. So let's actually be honest and ask ourselves, how come whenever a white cop, kills a black unarmed person, that there's no indictment? Let's just be honest.
In the case of the particular indictment or lack of indictment, I would agree with you. But what's important is that we're talking about larger issues, and some of them are practical. In the case of the New York cop, the police force is actually revisiting their chokehold policies, and that's a big deal. I mean, this is I'd never thought of chokehold policies until this case came up, because I've never been in a chokehold, and my friends haven't been in a chokehold. But for the first time, you have the national media talking about whether police forces should be using chokehold. I know that's not a sexy issue, but for a lot of people who could be subject to that, it could be a life or death thing. So even if the police officer in question never goes to jail, you know, you could save lives just by focusing on that.
What do you want to see, Pam?
Well, you know, words are meaningless. Press conferences are meaningless unless there's action behind it. And the police are their own worst enemy. Instead of pointing that out as a really bad scenario, this was wrong and we need to weed out the bad apples, the police forces consistently rally behind these people who murder people in cold blood under the justification of fear, or I thought he was reaching for his weapon, or you're just indigenous. I mean, we have countless examples here. J.J. Harper and Frank Paul and all of the people here in Canada who suffered under the police, and there's been no accountability.
So what needs to happen then?
Well, what needs to happen,
Really?
it's more than just public education. It has to come from the government down. There has to be laws, there has to be civilian oversight, there has to be special oversight by Indigenous peoples. If you're the target of the police here in Canada, there must be special oversight by Indigenous peoples. And this isn't something new. The United Nations is calling for this. The Office of the Correctional Investigator is calling for this.
It's interesting that they, shall I say, white panelists think that there's progress and are optimistic about that this will be a moment of change.
Well, I hope it's a moment. I don't know if it'll be a moment. I hope it is a moment of change, just as I do in terms of what's happening, the whole discussion about women and sexual harassment. There are these watershed moments which can bring change. If there are changes, I don't know if I would necessarily say create a second oversight body. I think including Aboriginal Canadians in oversight, increasing oversight in general, is a very important thing to do.
We've only got about a minute left, but last points to you, Desmond and
These are opportunities, the fact that we're even having these conversations, so welcome that. But at the same time, let's just take the issue of carding that you talked about off the top. We had a report recently.
Which you have to explain what that is. Where
just
people
really
are
quickly,
stopped
it's
on the
just
street.
that when people are stopped on the street and asked for their personal information. We had a report recently that the police changed their policy on it, but people in the community don't think they've changed their policy, that the police are behaving the exact same ways and stopping people. The chief of police in Toronto, Bill Blair, denied that that was actually going on. So how are we going to make progress if we have new rules and we have, as you say, talk is cheap?
Yeah,
Last point, Hannah,
it is. And if government and law enforcement can't change the words that come out of their mouth, society's not going to change their view of us. If the Department of National Defense calls Indigenous peoples terrorists, well, how do we expect Canadians to treat us? How do we expect law enforcement to treat us? And until that change, those fundamental internal changes happen, it's not going to change for us on the ground.
Thanks to all of you for being part of this conversation tonight.
Thank you.
We will be right back with these stories.
This is not business as usual in Alberta.
Canada goes through withdrawal after getting hooked on high-priced oil and poking fun at news.
Oh God, man, this is the National, not a bloody game show.
That's all ahead on The National.